We've heard from Sylvie, and in case you don't already know, Sylvie Delacroix is a professor in law and ethics at the University of Birmingham and also a Turing Fellow. We're then going to go on and hear from the three respondents. Neil Lawrence is DeepMind Professor of Machine Learning at the University of Cambridge and also a Senior AI Turing Fellow. Ebrad Mian is Director General of Decentralization and Growth at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And I should just check, I'm assuming, Emran, that you are here not speaking officially on behalf of the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. No, okay, so we can take this as your personal view and nobody go right into their MP. And David Leslie, who is a professor of Ethics, Technology and Society at Queen Mary University of London, is also Director of Ethics and Responsible Innovation Research at the Alan Turing Institute. But first of all, it's my great pleasure, and maybe I think you should greet her with a round of applause to hand over the microphone to Sylvie Delacroix.
Now, actually, I can build on what you just said, Timandra. So, can you hear me at the back? Is the microphone working? Great. Yes? Okay. So, this is organized by the Turing Institute, right? So, a nice hook. This book is not a book as such about data-intensive technologies. It's a book about whether there can be such a thing as habitual ethics, right? The question mark in the title is important. It's supposed to be provocative. And my answer to that question in a nutshell is, yes, there can be, but we haven't paid enough attention to the factors that can compromise the possibility of a positive answer to that question. Can there be such a thing as habitual ethics? So that's one line that goes through the book, right? So why are we talking about data-intensive technologies in that context, right? It's not just because, oops, it's organized by the Turing show, I should be talking about data-intensive technologies. No, I think actually there's a very good reason why it helps and it's interesting to start from that very concrete kind of starting point. Yeah. So Timandra touched upon the fact that today we hear a lot about how much and how well various types of, and I'm going to use the term data-intensive technologies to be generic, to not go into the specifics of whether it's a machine learning system, whether it's an augmentation tool, etc. So I'm just saying data-intensive technologies. Okay. Now, there's much debate about how much and how well those tools influence our judgment. Yeah. So there's lots of public-facing officials or non-officials who today couldn't do the work they do without relying, to sometimes a great extent, on those data-intensive technologies. And by this I mean police officers, I mean healthcare providers, I mean judges, etc. Right? So there are many functions that could be seen as critical to our public life, which are increasingly relying on those tools, those automated or augmentation tools, basically. Now there's much debate about how much and how well they influence the judgment of those public-facing actors. Okay. And I'm not here to say that that debate is not interesting or important. I'm more, the point of the book in part is to say that we haven't paid enough attention to the non-deliberative intelligence that also needs to be preserved. Okay, so what do I mean by non-deliberative intelligence? It may sound a bit off-putting to speak like that. Well, if you think about it, every day we do myriad intelligent things without really thinking about it, right? We just cope. We react to what the environment throws at us. And in many cases, there's great skill involved, right? So some of these things that we do without thinking about it are mundane, like let's say this morning I just threw a pair of jeans on, I didn't really think about it. Okay, is that intelligence? We could debate that. But there are also less mundane things. So I'll give you two examples. When neonatal nurses pick up signs of life-threatening infection before blood tests come back positive. This is a really interesting example where a study showed that these nurses seem to have an ability to pick up infections even though nobody could really explain how they picked up those infections. Yeah? So it was like how do they develop this skill to somehow see that a baby, these tiny newborns, had signs of a very critical infection? How nobody really knew, but they were quite reliably picking up those signs. Now, that study concluded saying, well, these are cases of skilled intuitions, okay? And then there were other studies, for instance, that looked at how firemen were able to sense when to evacuate a building, okay? And again, there was no model. There's no theory about when to evacuate a building. But they seem to have developed that skill, these intuitive intelligence skills, based on experience, based on immersion in an environment that gave them critical feedback. Now, what I'm going to say today is provocative for some, but I'm going to say that actually the way we navigate value-loaded situations on a daily basis is not that dissimilar to the way firemen sense when they need to evacuate a building or neonatal nurses sense that there's a sign of infection. Now, it's going to be provocative for some because actually a large strand of philosophy has insisted on arguing that when it comes to ethics, at least, we need to be in charge. And by we mean the deliberative selves, the kind of what some people call the Kantian captain, right? So that little entity in us that's supposed to control our desires and our instincts, etc. Now, when I say that when we navigate value-loaded situations, we actually deploy those intuitive skills in a way that's not dissimilar to firemen and neonatal nurses, I'm going against that, what I call an intellectualist trend in ethics and in ethical theory. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because when we only focus on deliberation, on that capacity we all have to deliberate about how we should live, etc., we get a very truncated understanding of the work involved in living an ethical life. What we miss is what I love, Murdoch talks of this little piecemeal business constitutive of ethical life. And I love the way she writes about this. And that little piecemeal business that goes in the background, that informs those deliberations, shouldn't be deprecated as non-intelligent. It's not only a form of intelligence, it's also, and this is what's significant, it's a form of intelligence that draws on intuitions that are, yes, similar to those relied on by firemen and neonatal nurses, but they're also different, and they're different in a significant way. Why are they different, those ethical intuitions? They're different because when we lose the ability to learn from our environment through interaction, through experimentation, these intuitions go wrong much quicker than the intuitions that, say, nurses or firemen will use. Why? Yeah. Why those intuitions go wrong much quicker? And I'm telling you this, you could dispute it. I'm not going to prove it right now, right? Well, they go wrong much quicker for a simple reason. It's because of the level of irreducible uncertainty that is characteristic of truly genuine ethical questions, right? So yes, firemen and neonatal nurses, they do face uncertainty, of course. I'm not denying that. But the amount of uncertainty that they face can be reduced by their expertise. Yeah, it may not be reduced to zero, but the skills they develop through experience will help them at least tackle this uncertainty. Well, not so when it comes to ethics, and that's an argument I make. So basically, when it comes to ethics, there is no telling in advance whom it is we need to be attentive to in order to live up to our ethical responsibility. That question is always open. It's never answerable a priori. And that demands a way of having habits that's particularly malleable, plastic, if you want. And that's never easy, but it becomes near impossible in an environment that has been optimized according to what I'm going to call our machine-readable past. Yeah, what is our machine-readable past? Well, it's all the clicks we make online, all the, not just the clicks, you can focus on the clicks, but actually most of our life now is machine-readable. Yeah, we go shopping, we've been scanned, or credit card use is being monitored, etc., etc. This is our machine-readable life. And it's an incredible amount of data points that we generate on a daily basis. And those data points are recorded. And those data points then feed a profile that will help infer about each of us our likely traits and beliefs, right? Now, the problem starts when the environment within which we act and within which we learn to live and to face ethical questions has been optimized according to those inferred traits and beliefs, right? So suddenly we're faced with a super smooth, an environment that has no dissonance, no possibility for encounters that could throw doubt on our deeply held beliefs and habits. And that's bad news. Why is it bad news when it comes to our ethical intuitions? Well, it's bad news because it's in those moments of dissonance that we stand a chance to effectively keep learning and keep experimenting. And sometimes it's a deeply uncomfortable experience, actually, to have to question what for some of us might be a worldview, a way of apprehending the world and our relationship to others, right? So what I'm trying to say here, and I'm trying to connect the dots, is basically saying, when it comes to our ethical intuitions, yeah, they play a significant role. They're not that dissimilar to the intuitions used by firemen and nurses, except for one thing. These intuitions can go wrong much quicker in an environment that deprives us of the ability to learn through experimentation, effectively, yeah? And so the environment that's been optimized according to our traits and beliefs, or these inferred traits and beliefs, that's an environment that's toxic for two reasons. It reduces our imagination, it narrows down our imagination, that's one. But the second thing that's far less spoken about is this ability to co-construct, to experiment, to influence the environment within which we work. Now, not all is not lost, and maybe, Timandra, should I stop now and talk about the positive answers to the problem, or should I?
Yeah, give us the hint towards the positive answer.
Okay, so I don't want to leave you with doom and gloom. So all is not lost. What can we do? Well, I mentioned only two things in the book. There are many other things we could do, of course. Yeah, it could be a long book otherwise, and I would never have finished it. So the two things I mentioned are, one, data trust, bottom-up data trust. Now, that's something I had great fun working on with Neil, and I'll come back to that. The other thing I mentioned, and it sounds cool for French-speaking people, I don't know if you will get it, but it's called ensemble contestability. Right. What is ensemble contestability features? Well, I find it entertaining, but you may not. I had a look at what some machine learning experts call ensemble methods. And these methods are supposed to reduce the extent to which an algorithm can be over-fitted, can be too fitted to a data set, right? So in order to avoid that problem, I'm not going to go into details. They use ensemble techniques, and Neil will correct me on that. Anyway, I kind of relaxed. I was relaxed about this. I borrowed from those techniques, thinking, oh, that looks very cool. And what was cool about that was the way in which the idea was to train different algorithms on different sub-data sets, right? And then computer scientists, for their purposes, they try to then average the results of those algorithms, yeah? But I don't propose we do that. What I propose to do is, for any public-facing algorithm, like education, for instance, yeah? An algorithm that provides remote learning, remote homework, okay? And it wants to optimize what kind of homework we give to X and Y, okay? So here the idea is, what does it take to have meaningful levels of contestability, meaningful levels of critical engagement with the outputs of that system? And what I propose is to say, well, instead of giving supposed explanations, and there's a whole sea of literature on that, instead of doing that, I propose we give each user of those systems an insight into how the output they get, like let's say I'm a student and I get really easy physics homework, and my brother gets really hard physics homework. And I want to know why I get the easy physics homework, right? I say, it's not fair, I want the tough stuff. And so I write to the course coordinator, and I say, why am I being given the easy physics homework, right? Now, currently, people could say, oh, well, you're going to be given an explanation, Sylvie. Don't worry, we're going to tell you that it's because of your psychological profile, the results you got in X and Y tests. That's why you're getting this thing. Does it help me? Does it help me change the way my homework is being given? No, it doesn't, right? So instead, I think it would be much more interesting to give me an insight into, oh, you would have had a different kind of homework if we'd used an algorithm that was trained differently on say, girls-only schools, data from girls-only schools, and then you would have had this kind of homework with an algorithm that was trained on, I don't know, like, doesn't use psychological tests, for instance, etc. And then I'd have a say. I could say, oh, but why don't we switch to this one? I much prefer the results by this, right? And we could have a debate, etc. Now, I think I've gone a bit too far, probably, in the concrete, in the weeds, as we say. But you told me to go for concrete interventions. So this is basically, the book was, I was keen to not remain at the level of theory. And that's why I went into the weeds in the last chapter, with very concrete proposals on how to increase the level of the extent to which we can truly co-construct our environment. Okay? That's what matters to me. And so increasingly our environment is structured by these technologies. Yeah? It's also structured by legal institutions, by the way, and I talk about that in the book too. There are some legal theorists in the room, they'll be pleased to hear. I haven't left legal theory altogether. But part of our environment is now really importantly shaped by these tools, and I think there's huge potential for insisting on design that really makes this possibility for co-construction central. Yeah, I'm going to stop.
Steal your microphone. Thank you, Sylvie. I think a round of applause is well earned here. And you've taken us from very high-level ethical considerations through the idea of human behavior in a social habitat and a technological habitat now, and into the very concrete. So a whole range of scope for you three to respond to. Obviously, you can't cover everything, so pick your things that you'd like to say, and let's hear from you first, Neil. Please use the microphone, if only because it's being recorded and put on YouTube, and you don't want the poor people watching on YouTube to have to lip read what you say.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much. And thank you, Sylvie, for I think a really wonderful book. I've been trying to read. I mean, often inspired by Sylvie. You know, I'm a machine learning researcher, so I'm learning a lot of these things. So I try and read some of the philosophical ideas. And I have been reading Kuhn's Structure of the Scientific Revolution and trying to understand his original concept of paradigm, and probably it's upsetting to all the philosophers to use it, so I'm about to use it, but I genuinely think what you were doing, well, for me, it's a piece of work that should bring about a paradigm shift in the way we think about ethics. And because I haven't finished because I've been reading you and Kuhn and all sorts of other people, I don't know what the ending is. But one of the things that I'm very interested in is how technology interplays with society. Of course, the Turing Institute itself is very interested in that. And I have sort of two principal thoughts on some of the things you've said in terms of the context of data-driven technologies, because I think we can just cut it in two ways. How does data-driven technology affect our thinking about ethics, and how does ethics affect our thinking about data-driven technology? And I think that really comes through in your work, because, of course, and then there's the context, the societal context about like what the effects are on society that are resulting from these things. We're just trying to break it down into those two terms. You mentioned, for example, the structure of dual process thinking as a Kahneman system 1 and system 2. I think coming at it from a machine learning perspective and how machines make decisions, the aspect that feels to me, and I'm ignorant of the literature, that is missing from a lot of the literature, even the cognitive science and the philosophical literature, these things are being driven by external factors. So the requirement for the brain to give an answer, for all animals to give an answer, is not a deliberative event. It's you need an answer now or else you'll die. type event. And much of, we're persistent beings, we're here because we tend to give good answers. So much of those responses is devolved. It's devolved not just in our brain, but to our spine, our ability to withdraw our hand from pain. And I think that the point that you're really driving at is amongst that spectrum, what you would call pre-reflective or pre-deliberative, is the bulk of our decision making by a massive quantity, because those decisions are going on all the time, even just into how to move our legs and how to walk. But going from that low level all the way up to how we react to a new stranger we see in the streets, like are we afraid, do we smile, these sort of things. And I think with habitual ethics, you sort of really, because of course the thought processes we spend the most time with are our deliberative ones, because they're the ones where an answer isn't required now. So they're rehearsals, they're ways of looking forward into the future and perhaps preparing ourselves for making those decisions. And I think that anyone, well, from my perspective, and as someone who's perhaps ignorant of the literature, you can't fail to read it and like any amazing text and just think, well, how could it ever have been thought of any differently from the way Sylvia is describing? And I think that is the mark of a book that leads a paradigm shift. Of course, we share our thoughts about this, so we should allow for ensemble contestability and other opinions, because that's one of the to me, that's actually all the essence of this. As Sylvie sort of rightly says, that we're different. Each of us has different sets of values and different sets of ethics, and one of the problems that we're facing with data-driven technologies is it's an imposition of a single set of values, regardless of where they come from, upon us. And we need to have more coffees and discuss the notion of ensemble contestability a lot. But I sort of want to stop there, because in the spirit of ensemble contestability, I think I've probably already gone on too long, and I think that getting as many perspectives and thoughts on the book as possible, as early as possible, is a good idea.
Thank you, Neil. Don't worry, we will come back to you, so you will get a chance to say more later on. Emra.
No, thank you, and hi everyone. So I'm not here to provide the HM government perspective on the book, I should say why I am here. I'm here, I think, for two reasons. The first is that my original training is in legal philosophy, and I acquired that training alongside Sylvie. We were PhD students together, so there's an affinity there. And then the second reason is I have, for about the 20 years since then, worked as a civil servant. And I believe profoundly that the exercise of public decision-making is a value-laden activity rather than a technocratic activity. And so I identify very strongly with the way in which Sylvie describes those value-laden situations. So on the basis of that perspective, I think there's probably three quick things I wanted to say. The first, and I think in some ways most important, is to admit that all the way through our PhD, Sylvie was right and I was wrong. Specifically that I focus on analytic legal philosophy, whereas Sylvie right from the beginning was talking about habits and norms and all that strong stuff. And she was absolutely right to be focused on that. She invited me tonight not knowing that I was going to make that admission, but I want to start by making that admission. I think the second point I want to make is explain why do I now think that that is the strong stuff. And that's because of my experience as a public decision maker or as an advisor to public decision makers. And what I've realized through that is that the exercise of public decision making is driven throughout by habit. And that this is not a bad thing, or not necessarily a bad thing. That'll be my third point. I'm going to go back to that. Let me give a couple of examples. So the first example is I was advising on some of the things that were done, especially at the very beginning of the pandemic, about restrictions on social activity, on what could be open and what had to be closed, and where those decisions were made. Those decisions, and people in the room will remember this, were profoundly made at a central government level. In time, we shifted that approach, and more of the decisions were made at a local level, but certainly in the beginning, those decisions were all made by central government and by very But neither of those are complete explanations for what was going on. I think the thing that completes the explanation is that there is a habit in centralized states like the UK of deciding that the central government makes these decisions, and then you'd have chaos if it wasn't the central government making these decisions. And so to properly understand what was going on there in terms of public decision making, I think you ought to understand the habits that were driving that decision making. I think the second example I'll give is from the very first job I did in the civil service, which was working on children's care cases. And it's a very similar example. The reason I wanted to use that example is because of the way in which Louis talks about neonatal nurses and the habits that they form, the judgments that they form, the instincts that they have, and how that drives their practice and their ethical decisions, in fact. And very much the same is true for children's social care workers. They have very deep expertise, and as a consequence of that deep expertise and experience, they are consistently making habit-driven and instinctive decisions about the situations that they are in for the welfare of the children that they are looking after. And then so are judges. So the children's social care worker prepares a case, it will come to the judge, and the judge too is driven by experience and instinct, making a set of habit-driven decisions in a value-laden situation. And so are the lawyers, and so are everybody else who's involved in the children's care case. And the problem becomes, this is my analysis, others will disagree with this analysis, is you have these different habit-driven exercises going on, and what we failed to create, or what we were failing to create at the point I was working on this, was the crucibles, if you like, where different people honestly shared what their instincts were, and the decision was then made on that basis. And instead, what we were doing in children's care cases was driving those instinct-driven, those habit-driven judgments out of the room almost, and reducing the decision-making to, here's a set of papers, let's do it on a set of papers. And of course you don't, the decisions simply weren't getting made. And so we had this pernicious situation where children's care cases were taking upwards of a year on average to conclude, and all the while the child was moving through temporary placements rather than a permanent decision being taken about whether the child stays with their family, is adopted, or anything else. And the key to tackling that is creating what I now realize is ensemble contestability. It's facilitating the crucible, it's creating a crucible where different people can genuinely share what they have learned from their habits in a value-laden situation, and you can make a decision about it. I'll go on to the third thing I want to say, which is I think there is a ambiguity that runs through all of this, which is quite a difficult one, which is, I find Sylvie's book extremely persuasive on how decision-making actually occurs, and extremely persuasive on how, in a context with how that is how decision-making occurs, how do you create better decision-making, or good decision-making. But then the question is, what constitutes good decision-making? What are the ultimate standards of ethics that we're trying to meet when it comes to decision-making? Which is, can be a contextual decision. There's, I think, elements of it that are meta-ethical as well. I think that is quite difficult to figure out, especially in a context where all of us will be approaching that meta-ethical judgment with our own habits also. And what I would love to kind of discuss a bit further is, in the end, is there no way out? And that our habit-driven judgments about habit-driven decision-making are themselves driven by habits? Or do we somewhere, is there a crack in everything that lets the light in from some more meta-ethical way of thinking about this?
Thank you, Emran, for throwing open a meta level of questions for us all to think about. So I hope you're all thinking about that and you're going to come back with some answers shortly. David, over to you.
Thanks. I think there's just 1,000 things that could be said about the book. I wanted to focus maybe on two points, one that is cautionary and one that is constructive. think the cautionary message that I get from the book is that we really need to pay attention to the poverty of behaviorism that all too often nowadays drives the design development of algorithmic systems. And if you just go onto Google Patents and search algorithmic system or artificial intelligence, it really is, in a sense, oftentimes disturbing, because what you see is there's a treatment of the self, the human individual, as a kind of malleable stimulus response system. Right? The data subject is treated kind of like clay that can be molded, right, by the kind of construction of an automated system. And in a sense, there's an end goal here, which is to render the targets of hyper-personalized curation, the targets of behavioral steering, say in workplace algorithms, to render these individuals as predictable. Predictability is a value, in a sense, that guides a lot of behaviorism, that drives the construction of these systems. And we really need to be aware of that. What Sylvia talked about as this kind of, I don't know, machine-readable archive of the self, right? This idea that we leave these digital traces, and then they can come to form an optimization, right, of the behavior that will sort of guide action of tomorrow, right? This is, in a sense, an approach that we can think of as potentially irresponsible. And I think I got from the book a way to kind of think of this as irresponsible, right? So there's a tradition of thinking, a tradition of thinkers that would say, well, we can't reduce the self to behaviors or a set or collection of behaviors. The self has a character. The self is formed in society, and that process of self-formation creates the content of the self, the second nature of the self. And if we don't take care of the way in which that self it has formed in modern society, we can, at the end of the day, end up extinguishing what we recognize as, say, a modern, deliberative, autonomous self. Foucault talks about he has this image of a face being drawn into the sand at low tide, and then ultimately, as high tide comes in, it just washes the face right away. And if we're not aware that reducing the self to behavior can create that dynamic, then we may well be too late to the game. And I think what Sylvie's book does is it introduces us to this alternative tradition of thinking. It has its roots in Aristotle and others, I would say even deeper maybe, where what we're thinking of is a process of self-formation, acculturation, and the creation of agency through our interactions and through the ways in which our interactions crystallize into the habits that then enable us to act and operate in the world. And I think this brings me to just the constructive side of things, which is that we may use terms nowadays like the autonomous self or autonomy, dignity, in a fast and loose way. But what we are oftentimes not aware of is that there are preconditions to the habits that enable us to be a modern autonomous agent. And we need to really think about what are those preconditions? How is it that in modern democratic forms of life, we move around and reproduce the world together with one another by interacting and engaging in dissonant conversations and confronting otherness in front of us. And through this kind of wheel and woe interaction, our self forms, other selves form. And this is something that I think we have to embrace the value
Thank you, David. And I think before I come out and start to garner your thoughts and try to, I can see you all looking thoughtful. I hope some of those are going to crystallise into some words so we can bring the conversation out into ensemble co-creation and constructive discussion. But first, I would like to give you a chance, if you'd like to come back and pick up on any of these points, either to build on them or dispute them or whatever else you'd like.
Well, I think I see one thread that's kind of running through the three interventions, I call them. And I think I really liked M1's point about the fact that, it's all very good to say, habits and habituation in general shapes, or not just our sense of self, but our sense of what's right and what's wrong, etc. There's a part of the story that's clearly missing if we're going to be talking about ethics seriously here. And that part of the story has to be, well, what constitutes a good judgment? That's how you ask the question, right? There's got to be, at some point, we have to stop talking about habit, don't we? And here, I was trying to think, how can I've made a commitment to, I said to everyone, before I come here, I'm not going to talk about meta-ethics because I just don't want to lose you guys. But actually, so I'm trying to think, how can I speak about meta-ethics in a way that's just not off-putting? And I was thinking, okay, there's one way maybe. And this way is, so David talked about Aristotle, and I don't know if you've heard a little bit about Aristotle, but Aristotle is famous for many reasons, but one of them is that he insists on the fact that there's a process of habituation that all human creatures have to go through as a kind of process of education of our senses. And that education of our senses is absolutely essential to our being capable of what he calls phronesis, and that's the art of judgment, effectively, the art of ethical judgment, right? Now, I would definitely gladly endorse the Aristotelian label for my position, except for one thing. Yeah, well, that's where I'm not entirely Aristotelian, I hope anyway. There are two aspects where I probably depart. One is, I would say that this process of habituation, so this process through which we all, since birth, grow up, educating not just our senses, the physical senses, but also our sense of what's right and wrong, right? We pick that up from our environment, the people who care about us and we care about. But for some classic Aristotelian thinkers, they like to think that this process of habituation can come to an end. That at least for the enlightened, for the phronesis, once you've educated your senses, then you can claim enlightenment in some sense, right? And I'm very wary of that. I'm very wary of that because I would say the process of habituation can never come to an end. And it's very, very dangerous to ever claim that it's been done. And why? And this is what's going to hopefully help me tackle M1's question. Why can't the process of habituation never come to an end? Well, the way I've tried to build an answer to M1's challenge, effectively, is in the first chapter of the book, I developed what I call a non-reductive naturalism. Now, for most of you, that's going to be flying like that. What is naturalism, etc. Basically, the easy answer to what is naturalism is to say, well, you're not a naturalist unless, if you refer to things outside nature to explain X or Y, then you're not a naturalist. That would be the very easy, lowest common denominator. The problem is that doesn't tell you much, right? Because you need to define what nature is. And a lot hangs on how rich you allow nature to be, yeah? There are some naturalists out there who insist on nature being reduced to causal facts, right? And that becomes a very shrunken nature that's completely devoid of our hopes or projections, etc. And there are other naturalists, whom I call these non-reductive naturalists, who say, no, but nature is always nature as we inhabit it. There's no such thing as a nature detached of the human touch. So that's what we have at our disposal. It's this rich, humanly pervaded nature. And that means forget about the kind of scientific conception of objectivity where things are true only if they correspond to objects that exist out there. Forget about that. Now, I'm telling you all this because the answer to M1's challenge, it's not an easy answer, but it comes like this. It says, well, if you want to explain our capacity we do share to have meaningful arguments and to try and solve these disagreements about what's right and what's wrong, you have to make room for the fact that we are creatures with needs and desires, yes. We're also creatures who are capable of what I call an ethics of attention, effectively. It's a way of learning from the other. Now, there's a famous French author called Levinas who's talked about the face of the other in a very almost mystical way. And I always feel, oh, no, I'm not that French. I'm not going to talk like that. And so I go to great pains in the book to avoid that language. I don't want to speak about the face of the other. But I do actually speak about the other a lot. I sometimes put a majuscule like the other. So the whole chapter 5 is all about our receptivity to the other. And I wouldn't claim to have gotten you the definite, robust answer to that challenge, what makes us capable of solving ethical disagreements. But at least I would claim to have located an answer that is not relying on any supernatural intervention, whether it's the Kantian categorical imperative, because I deem it a supernatural intervention, or godlike interventions, etc. I only stick to facts about us, about human nature. And one of those facts that I take to be significant is the fact that we are actually deeply receptive and capable of learning from each other. And that's where I'm going to stop for now. Yeah.
I wondered, sorry to come back on that, I wondered if there's an additional argument, I'm getting very meta here, that you would make against me, which is that I think what philosophy often does and what ethics often does, it ends up talking only about the edge cases, the most difficult cases of all. And actually in most of the choices that we face in life, they're not edge cases. And I would aver that in many of the cases that we're specifically talking about tonight, where data-driven technologies are in play, actually they're not edge cases either. And I wonder whether there's a habitual ethics, which is essentially making the argument that for the vast majority of decisions that we face, it's perfectly fine to use your habits. And actually, it's not just an efficient decision-making mechanism, it is a good decision-making mechanism. And sometimes even relying on the habits of other people, and that pattern of decision-making is a good thing to do. You know, to use an example from the road outside, I go past that road every day when I take my kids to school. We're in a bus. There is a habit of drivers on the Euston Road that you let the bus come out, right, after the bus stop. If every driver made that decision on every single instance on the basis of an ethical judgment about should I do this or should I not do this, that would cause more traffic than every driver simply pausing for the bus. It's a trivial example, but what I'm getting at is that for most of the choices that we face, I think it's perfectly fine and probably perfectly good for us to make them on the basis of habit. It's only the edge cases, perhaps, where we need to go beyond our habits. And I think sometimes the mistake that philosophy makes, it only talks about the edge cases. And I think one of the things that's really powerful about this book and about the account that you give about habitual ethics is it covers the vast majority of the decisions that perhaps we're faced with in our lives.
Are you burning to say something, Neil? Because I do want to give people in the audience the chance to come in.
Yes, burning.
Okay, burn fast and bright, and then
I'll try and burn fast and
audience.
bright. Because I wanted to stitch a few of the things that were said together. I thought they were brilliant from everyone. But I think this notion that Sylvia introduced of irreducible uncertainty of the ethics is really, really key here. And relates to the thing she said about Aristotle. You don't reach enlightenment because the notion of enlightenment that there's one way of doing things is broken. We don't have one way of doing things. That's absolutely clear. And that's why there's irreducible uncertainty and there's opinion about what those right ethics can be. And once you sort of accept that, then I think some of the things that Emran was saying sort of follow. Well, all we can do is look around and see which things are effective in practice and try and follow. And the reason this is very important people have this idea that, a computer will be able to fix this. No, absolutely not. Because the challenge is that when you're trying to predict the outcome of these actions, the computational load of that is so high to have any sense of what's going to happen next. You just can't do it. So you have to take shortcuts. You can't predict the way the universe is going to evolve. It's just absolutely not possible. You can't even predict how two molecules are going to interact. So what you end up doing is you take empirical shortcuts of things that you see are effective in the world, and you borrow those things, and that's the trick behind machine learning. Now, the challenge with that is that those things become layered, and that's what Emran was talking about in terms of the judges and the decisions about these really important issues like child support. Those things become embedded and not revisited, and I think this is the sort of key point that sort of Sylvie's raising. And we also see that in our motor system. So your motor system works on a set of motor primitives. So the way you choose to walk is that there's a load of devolved action about how your motor system is responding to the senses it has coming in. And you just call those motor primitives. And what Sylvie's hinting at is there are also ethical primitives that are being operated on. Now, the challenge is in a rapidly evolving society where we've got new digital technologies and new things occurring, we need to address how those ethical primitives are operating. And I think that was the point that David was bringing up. But I just really want to sort of add that it was quite sort of depressing, democracy could be destroyed. But there's an alternative. There's an alternative that actually, by becoming far more aware of this issue, as Sylvie's book is causing us to be, and as the operation of digital technologies that exploit this basically is making us more aware, we can look for better ways of doing things. We can sort of say, actually, we could do a better job at child support. We certainly could do a better job at child support. And if we start to recognize some of the things Sylvie's saying, I mean, that's in front of us. That wasn't fast, but yeah, I'll stop. Sorry.
It was reasonably fast. David, are you burning to say anything before I go out? No, excellent. So, who would like to say something good? Okay, so we've got a hand here. Are you doing the right? So we've got a hand here, the green scarf, and then one over here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take three, and then I'll come back and give you guys a chance to chip in. Go on.
Hi, thank you all for one of the best talks on ethics in this space that I've heard in a really long time, and I've heard quite a lot of them because I'm a bit of a junkie. But I guess my question is, taking on board a starting point that I agree with everything that's been said here, I guess my challenge to you is how do we nurture a desire for ensemble contestability in a society that has been, let's face it, very clearly seduced by the promise of an absence of dissonance, and indeed enjoys an absence of dissonance. And in the child care question, you know, people are relying on machine learning tools so that they themselves don't have to make decisions, rather than actually engaging in that active, quite challenging and difficult process.
How do we nurture an appetite for dissidence? Marvellous. And could we get the microphone over to that guy there on the other aisle? The other aisle there. Put your hand up again, Michael. Yeah. and then up. There was someone at the back as well. Now, Neil would like people to introduce themselves. I feel agnostic about this. If you'd like to say who you are, do. If you don't want to, don't.
And Michael, I know most people on the panel. On the issue of ensemble contestability, the example that you gave, Sylvie, has somebody giving homework, and in your book you've got boys' school and girls' school alternative models, but it still assumes that you're sort of selecting within the model space that's being given. And I wonder what you'd reflect on saying, well, maybe the necessary alternative models are costly to create, were never the data that would need you to create them was never labeled in that first place, or would require an entirely different political economy of our digital world to be able to suggest. Can we get to something meaningful from ensemble contestability if we just restrict ourselves to the same kind of cheap data sources that fueled the initial decision to begin with?
Marvellous, thank you. And someone at the back in that block? Yes, there you go. And then I'll come back and let you all have your say again.
Hi, Carolyn Pedwell from University of Kent. I've read Sylvie's book, really enjoy it. Thank you for the panel discussion. I wondered if there's also something to say more, and I think you explore this in the book, Sylvie, about how we conceptualize habits. Do we tend to think of them as individual possessions or characteristics? And what happens if we think about habits, like I say, in the pragmatist philosophical tradition, as ongoing interactions between minds, bodies, and environments, where environments can be conceptualized very broadly. Because if you do that, then it becomes much less possible to be aware of what your habits are, because habits are never only ever your own, and certainly very difficult to control them. So the idea that we could all be honest about what habits or impulses are driving our decisions becomes much more complicated when, you know, these are distributed habits that are, you know, kind of working systems. And then I guess the second part of that is then what further complications when we're thinking about ethics or politics do machine learning systems add to this? So we're dealing with trying to think about ethical questions which are distributed but also at less than conscious levels. And then in kind of like post-cybernetic understandings of machine learning, where we're not just thinking about simple inputs and outputs that can be measured or predicted in easy ways. Kind of, I'm just wondering if there's maybe a bit more you could say about that.
Marvellous. Okay, well, that's plenty to be going on with. David, I'm going to start with you, since you didn't get a chance last night. Obviously, don't feel you have to answer everything. Don't feel you have to limit yourself to direct answers. Whatever you'd like to say.
Sure. I mean, just to think out loud on the back of what Michael said, I think we need to get to the basics when we think about the potential to have transformative environments where we can, in a sense, push back on these trends towards automation. And I see it more as a need to build out grassroots forms of democratic interaction, in just the sense that it is the case that just more of the same in terms of the way, you know, data is commodified and collected and used to sort of sculpt options for people doesn't get at the root problem here, which is that it's the agent, and democratic agent in particular, that will always be at the source of political development, political transformation. And oftentimes we find ourselves, in a sense, putting a parenthesis around our thinking, because we are in this kind of world of AI and technology, and we don't think about the sublayers that are necessary for us to have actual positive change in the technological world. And so, just to say, I think that we do need to dig a layer deeper if we are going to get at some of these problems of political economy, some of these other problems that create these, you know, relatively disturbing conditions that we're facing. And I would just finally say, I agree with you, Neil. I think that it might have come off a bit pessimistic in what I said, but the truth is actually, if we look at the way in which there's been a kind of boomerang effect of thinking deeply, for instance, about, you know, AI fairness, AI bias, and the ways in which there's a deepening of reflexivity that's come with thinking about the metrics, thinking about how we kind of allocate outcomes, that may well not have happened were it not for the increased concentration on this problem set. And in a very similar way, a renewed kind of attention to the impacts of technology that's coming with these calls for impact assessment are bringing to the table questions about ethical values that might not have otherwise been considered when it comes to making decisions about how we use technology, how we design and develop technology. And so I think we do need to take an optimistic point of view, in a sense, and realize that actually these sort of windfall changes that are happening are within our control, and we simply can't be deterministic about it. We have to you know, do, as Hegel says, see the rose in the cross of the present, right? See that there is a kind of potential rational content, critical content in the way things are unfolding in front of us.
I'm just going to jump in here, abusing my chair's privilege, because it strikes me that if we're talking about the data-driven technological habitat, in a sense, in which we live and in which our habits are increasingly formed, does that not also apply to the process of reflection? So in a sense, are the ways that we think about fairness in algorithms and so on, whereas it's great that we are forced to explicitly say, well, what do we mean by fairness and so on, but in a way, those questions and conversations are in themselves shaped, the assumptions and the habits are in themselves shaped by the nature of the technology that is throwing them up to us.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, my view is if you look at the evolution of the algorithmic bias and fairness literature, say the way we confront these over the last 5 years, 10 years, one notices that there were very cramped notions of fairness that were located within a kind of formalistic point of view and dominated by a kind of techno-scientific solutionist methodology, right? Where it was just, can you figure out this fairness, how to operationalize this fairness metric in this system? But what happens over time is that because of dissonance, because of debate, there was an increasing acknowledgement that actually that cramped notion of fairness, cramped in the technology, wasn't sufficient to pick up things like structural discrimination, things like wider systemic issues with decision-making that comes into deciding to design and deploy a system in the first place. And those wider fairness issues are societal fairness issues. They're about inequity and injustice on a wider scale. And so, in a sense, yes, the conversation is limited in a way by the fact that it's emerging out of that kind of data-driven technology world. But the issues themselves are as old as the sun. I mean, the issues themselves, the issues of historical discrimination that get drawn into data ecosystems and legacies of discrimination, legacies of injustice, coloniality. These things are patterns that need to be confronted by humans as such. And if anything, the technology might just be a trigger, an opportunity, in just as Neil was saying, for us to kind of really address the problems.
Thanks. Emran, what would you like to respond to? I'm particularly interested, you don't have to answer this, but I'm particularly interested in the promoting an appetite for dissonance.
So that's exactly where I wanted to go, actually. It's on dissonance, and kind of two reflections on the appetite for dissonance. One is that I think lots of public decision makers, and I include myself in this, we have an appetite for dissonance. That's why we do what we do. Because you're drawn to where the dissonance is, because that's where the complexity is, that's where public decision making needs to take place. And so you want to go there and you want to do it. Now I think that's a useful thing for all of us to know about public decision makers. There's times at which we might want to be wary about it, but it seems to me lots of public decision makers demonstrate that appetite for dissonance. The other thing I was wondering about, just as I was reading Sylvie's book, was about whether there's an aspect of habitual ethics which is about deciding where to exert the greatest part of our ethical energy, if you like. And so habitual ethics is using our habits of decision-making for the vast majority of choices that we face, so that we reserve our ethical bandwidth, if you like, for the truly hard choices. And I wonder if there too there's something about people who run or create data-driven technologies, which is for the vast majority of decisions that are made on their platforms or in the exercise of their technologies, actually it might be perfectly fine for those to be done by habits, that their ethical bandwidth, if you like, is reserved for the truly difficult issues. And given ethical bandwidth is a finite commodity for all of us as individuals, but also for any institution, actually we should be making ethical judgments about what we're keeping ethical bandwidth to do. So I think I probably want, a data-driven platform to be reserving its ethical bandwidth for, I don't know, what it decides to show my children, rather than what it decides to show me as an adult. That would be a sensible choice, I think, for a data-driven platform to make.
And maybe for laws. Anyway, Neil, I will.
I want to completely agree about dissonance. In fact, that's why I was keen for speakers to introduce themselves, because I thought it was such a good question. And I think Emran's actually already done enough material to highlight why I think that's such a good question. But I think I want to sort of combine it with what Emran's saying and move quickly on to get more questions in. That I think that the concept that he just introduced around ethical bandwidth is so critical. And one could argue that the shift that David is talking about that needs to require in society is a shift of ethical bandwidth. And that what we're going through is that process at the moment. And I think one of the big challenges we face is what I tend to talk about as vivid risks. I can tell you narratives about killer AIs and all these sort of things that will frighten everyone and make everyone run around screaming that aren't necessarily the risks. And the problem with the dissonance thing is, I think it is, the public decision makers are sort of really keen on that because they recognize that's where the issues are. But for a lot of people, it's indigestible. One of the things that, for example, is very hard to communicate with people is why you want inconsistency. Because if you talk to judges, and Sylvia and I have talked about this a lot, but I had this experience at the Royal Society where a group of judges said, well, we can already see that machine learning systems are more consistent. These were high court judges, more consistent than we are. So that's clearly a good thing. And I was like, whoa! Because they've conflated consistency and correctness. So the challenge is that, yes, a system that is correct will be consistent. But if you accept that no system can ever be 100% correct, your follow-up question is, would you like it to make errors consistently or inconsistently? And then it becomes obvious you want inconsistent errors. So you actually want inconsistency. But this is going right to the heart of the ensemble contestability argument. You want inconsistency, and humans are inconsistent. This is one of the beautiful things about us. But how do you persuade the population that you should have that? And that's a very hard question.
Respond to it,
okay.
And then I will come out again.
But I'm not going to talk to it because I can see some people are impatient to ask their questions. But this, I'm going to tell you a secret. I don't think many people know this, except maybe at least one person in this room. But initially, it's taken me an awfully long time to write this book, right? Really embarrassingly long time. But there were detours, like data trust detour that took me a lot of. But when I started, I was actually fascinated by the question of moral change. What really triggered my research was I was thinking, so how does moral change happen? How do we retain the capacity to change things? We all immersed in an environment, and we ethicists, lawyers, we keep talking about the importance of civic disobedience, that we should all be ready to break the law at time when the law is unjust. We should, this is the whole legal positivism debate that Emran and I have heard too much. But so there's been a lot of emphasis on a capacity that's often taken for granted, as if, of course, we will know when to stand up and question the law and change it because it is unjust. Well, actually, I don't find that obvious. And so the start of the book was really, then how does moral change happen? And where do we get the resources? What do we jump on, if you want? If I'm always thinking of the springboard, where you jump in the pool. What do we step on to actually trigger moral change? If all we have at our disposal are basically socially conditioned habits of thoughts, emotions, etc. If all we really have at our disposal is that, then what are the chances that, say, if I was educated in apartheid South Africa, how would I know that I need to stand against the injustice of apartheid, right? And so that was the thing that was bothering me, and I was making no progress at all. It was like a tempest in a cup of tea, because I realized actually I wasn't making no progress because the whole question of moral change kept slipping through my fingers. I was like, yeah, but what is change? What counts as change? And actually, I started making progress only once I started asking, what can stand in the way of change? And I was like, habits. And that suddenly I had something I could claw my hands on and start making a little progress, at least in my mind. And so I'm saying this because there were lots of great questions. Michael's question is super important. The ensemble contestability example. was an effort I made to go deep into a super concrete proposed intervention, borrowing on existing techniques. So basically saying, I'm not calling for, often philosophers, they love talking about, oh, if only we could do this, this and that, without worrying about what's possible, what we can do concretely. And so I tried to do that. Yeah? And of course, it's going to be clumsy. And also, it's going to sound awfully naive, because as you say, Michael, I mean, the quality of the data we have at the moment is so far from being good enough just for one properly trained algorithm, let alone then several parallel trained algorithms, etc. So there's an answer. I'm not going to talk much about data trust, because I've talked too much about data trust. Like I've spent too much time talking about data trust. But it is a possible answer. It's basically saying, actually, data trust in a nutshell, it's all about saying groups of people can come together and pool together the rights they have over their data to obtain better terms and conditions with service providers, basically monitor data sharing agreements, etc. And the idea here is basically, at the core of it, is a political idea, is to say, we've underestimated the political dimension of data. Yes, data can be a tool for economic growth, etc. We've heard a lot about that. But what we haven't heard about so much is the fact that data can also be a tool for political enfranchisement. And that can mean all sorts of things. Some people can come together with a view of, say, improving the use of natural resources or better healthcare. Others will say, no, I just want the money, thank you very much, I want to maximize financial returns. And others might say, we want better schooling for children, for instance, right? Now, so we will have different aspirations, different attitude to risk, etc. And the idea behind data trust is to say, let's break the one-size-fits-all approach to data governance. Let's put in place an infrastructure that acknowledges this collective dimension of habit and the political dimension of habit. Effectively, that you can acquire political voice through data. I'm going to stop here, but that's kind of an answer to your question about quality of data. Because if data trust do see light of day, or other things, by the way, I'm not religious about data trust, it can be all sorts of things, then we may stand a chance of getting better data sets. So that's one quick answer. Oh, and Caroline, I'm not going to do justice to your question now, but if I get a chance, I'll come back to it, because I'd love to. So.
Okay, now what I'm going to do, look at my watch, I'm going to try and basically take all the points and questions from the room and then come back one last time and give you all the last word. And then we will go and have the informal discussion over drinks, which, as we all know, is where you really get time to go into things. So please put your hands up if you'd like to say something. Oh, lots of hands now. Okay, so I think you have had your hand up for a long time, so we'll start with you and then we'll come up here. So, yeah. But this is the point at which to not be shy and actually, or you can go to the Slido if you.
Okay, so I did actually put this on Slido. I am all the anonymous comments on Slido. No, you can't tell. You will never know.
How can you possibly know that? Okay, carry on.
I'm John Crowcroft from the Turing Institute and also from Cambridge University. Right, Neil, I know Michael over there and so on. Anyway, no, I was going to just say we've had this discussion about various aspects of the organization of data and ownership and things like that, which has been going on for ages, and centralized, decentralized, distributed and so on. Owned by the community. There are many examples of that around. And then we have this discussion about the fairness in the algorithms. And there was a small number of definition of fairness, which we all know about, and they're getting a bit more. But what of course, we then hear about a small number of ways of organizing society and businesses. But actually, when you ever teach people, you discover that there's an incredibly wide range of, there's neurodiversity. Humans are hacks. Their brains have evolved in the most bizarre ways. And that actually what I haven't heard anyone address is actually what is the idea of having any consensus? And I'm not talking about, we live in a solipsistic world where we can't understand anyone else. Clearly we do. We have empathy and we have these other things that work. But we don't know why they work because we don't understand how all the different neurodiverse systems fit together. And until we do that, we won't come up with constructive ways of organizing society and economics and ownership of data and fairness of algorithms, as far as I'm concerned, because we won't actually address things like, somebody said democracy. What a ludicrous idea. Majorities suppress minorities, which destroys anything to do with diversity, because there are large numbers of minorities. And there are far more minorities when you look at power sets than there are, majorities. So that's immediately a non-starter. And, for-profit ownership is obviously a non-starter. So there are a bunch of organizational issues which, until we get to grips with the underlying fundamentals of actual intelligence, we're not really going to be able to address. So sorry to make a bit of a rant, but I felt that was sort of missing, as a missing dimension. I'm just demonstrating I'm a point on that neurodiverse, very large space.
Okay, great. So we've now exploded the idea of habit, the idea of ethics, the idea of democracy. We're going to be left with nothing intact by the end of the evening. So we had a couple of hands up that side again. Yes, so there. And if you're in two minds now about whether to say anything, put your hand up now. Good. Okay. So then we'll go up to the back to those two. Yeah.
Hi, Timandra. Hi. Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking. I'm Natalia. At the daytime, I work for a technology company. In the evenings, I study philosophy, and I've just finished my dissertation on a subject similar to what we're discussing. So my natural question is about the link between academic research and business. Obviously, when you look at DeepMind, you have a great research facility discussing, not you, okay. So large companies obviously think about that. At the same time, we have zillions of smaller AI companies producing technologies every day. How is it working? How do you communicate? Do you push your knowledge out? Do they have to seek that knowledge? Do you see increasing interest from smaller companies? Are they paying more attention to AI and ethics? What's the trend? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Great, very concrete, practical question. Thank you. So there were two hands at the back. Yes, so it doesn't really matter which order. Yes, there you go.
Yeah, hi, I'm Johnny. I haven't really got a question. It's sort of an observation. It's a point where you have to do what you can with it. Neil mentioned something about thinking fast and slow, which I guess is to some extent instinct. And then there's people who talk about instinct and habit as if they're the same. I don't think they are the same. I studied biology originally, so I come at everything from an animal behavior point of view. So what is animal behavior about? It's about survival, food, and belonging. So how, and survival is about dealing with fear to protect us. I guess food is about reward, and belonging is about doing what other people are doing. And like I say, I haven't really got a clear point as to what to make, but I'm just curious to the extent to which we sort of factor in fear, belonging, reward into habit, and we talk about data and ethics. And I just picked up, for example, the COVID point. For me, that was not a data-driven, or how we dealt with that was not data-driven. It was about fear and belonging. Those are the things that were driving the decision-making. So we can present it as I don't know, ethics, AI, data, whatever, but that was underlying. I've got teenage students. My approach to how it would have been dealt with would be different to someone who had a very elderly relative who was sick, for example. That's not data-driven. That feels like a instinctual fear and belonging type stuff. So I haven't really got a question. It's a topic that may or not be relevant.
Points are also fine, as I said at the beginning. You don't have to pose it as a question if it's a point. Thank you.
Hi. Thanks very much. First of all, congratulations, Sylvie, for a wonderful book and also a really interesting talk, so much appreciated. A lot of this has been already covered, but I was wondering what your opinion is for the role of law, really, in all that. And I know, we're talking about hard cases or edge cases in which perhaps small change can occur, and for the rest, kind of outsourcing maybe to habitual ethics, if I understood correctly. And so just wanted to push you a little bit more on unpacking. I know it's very interdisciplinary, the conversation, and that's the beauty of it. But still, maybe just a point about how do you see that correlating with technology and society, to pick up on Neil's point, and then the role of law. And unsurprisingly, I'm a professor of law and society in Austria. My name is Biljana. Thank you.
Marvellous. Okay, so everybody else, this is your last chance. Excellent. There's a hand down here. Anybody else? Stick your hand up now, or just collar us over wine in the reception. The choice is yours.
Hi, sorry. I think your speech is very inspiring to me, especially for my PhD project. So I'm Haran Shi, I'm from LSE. In terms of how you explain habits, I'm wondering what's your opinions on determining the consistencies between certain strong attitude and certain very extreme behaviors, the consistency between them, to what extent that, that relates to habits. But sometimes I think that when we have a strong attitude, that the behaviors that arise from that attitude almost becomes habits. And to some extent that you make some very instinctual responses because you know that you have this kind of attitude. I'm wondering what kind of, especially data science, from data science point of view, what kind of devices that we can, or interventions that we can have, or factors that may contribute to break this this relationships or this habitual responses from that attitude to behaviors. Because I think that to some extent that some attitude, when they translate into behaviors, that if behavior become very extreme and become violent, especially in political scenes, I think. And then I'm just wondering what's your opinion on this kind of relationship at all. So what kind of factors do you think may contribute to break this consistencies? But yeah.
Okay, great. So absolutely last chance. Anyone else? I assume we've got nothing coming in the slide apart from... good, excellent, there you go.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Lubomir Radowska, University of Kent. And my question is really about habits. Thinking about the first example, Sylvie, you gave about the nurses and the firefighters, I could understand the role of habit there as a kind of know-how, right? Professional know-how. But then, do we still think in this kind of way when we start applying the notion of habit to ethical agency? Or do we have something that is a bit deeper and also, as it were, connects to reasons why, right? I just want to see that because ultimately the opponents of your project might say that, well, yes, there is intelligence in habits, but it is not of the right kind for ethics, because it isn't simply that we want to know how to do things. We want to know whether we're doing the right sorts of things. And for that, we have to ask first the question why, rather than the question how.
Well, that's a great note to end on, to come back, because it is kind of, in a way, also the starting point of the book is to try and say, I will leave you to answer this, but why indeed we should think of habits as matters for ethics. So what I propose to do is let you three have your final say and then come back to Sylvie to have the last word. So Neil, you'd like to start us off?
Brilliant. So I'll try and take points in order. So my answer to John's point on neurodiversity, I think yes, and we want that because of the inconsistency. But as a networking person, you'll know the other constraint we have is a very narrow bandwidth for communication. So although compute is often the problem in preventing us from getting to the real answer, as networking nodes, which John appreciate, we have enormous capability to do computation and a very limited ability to communicate. So I would call the ratio between those two the embodiment factor. So our computation is highly embodied versus a computer which can communicate many, many million times faster than us, and that's one of the reasons they can undermine us in the way that David has talked about and that Sylvie talks about in the book. So that means that one of the ways we communicate is we second guess each other all the time. So we actually spend a lot more time teaching other people who we are rather than saying what we're going to do, because once I've taught you who I am, you can predict what I'm going to do. And that's the reason why there's consistency. So because that would not work if we were all utterly different. And that's the reason why shared values become quite important and our intention with this inconsistency. And I think that tension between the two is this sort of really interesting thing. And of course, cultures decide on what those shared values, those shared behaviors are going to be across many generations. And that's the sort of thing that we're trying to unpick now that the computer is interloping on that. are small companies, Natalie, your question, are small companies interested? Yes, and I think one of the really challenging problems we have is that small companies are often trying to deploy innovative and helpful solutions, but they've got a limited bandwidth themselves, and they will often not understand how to do things well. So my senior AI fellowship at the Turing is actually all about building tools, practices, techniques that mean that small companies will habitually fulfill these things correctly. So, because that's one way you can access this. If you give people the right tool set, so they will do good ethical things habitually by allowing them to see where things go wrong, then you can potentially address this sort of problem. But it's very, very difficult for small companies. It's very hard to deploy these solutions, to innovate, and then to understand what they've done and what the negative consequences. So even good actors, it's very, very hard. And then, Johnny, I thought your statement about instinct and habit was very well posed. I think I've certainly been using the term loosely, and I think that looking at animal behavior is incredibly informative for a lot of what sort of Sylvie is talking about, because animals, to the extent that they are doing reflective thinking, we don't fully understand, but we would claim they're doing far less of it than us. I think we would all agree on that. And yet they operate in societies. They do things which one could potentially, and I don't know if you've ever thought about this, Sylvie, talk about as ethical in some sort of form. And I think the separation between instinct and habit, very well posed, and I've certainly been doing that sloppily, so apologies for that. And I thought the other two questions were great, but I thought I had less expertise on them. I'll pass them on.
And so I'm going to cheat. I'm going to go back to a question from the previous round, but I think it connects to some of the issues that people have just raised in this round, which is the question towards the back about what is a habit, which I've been thinking about since the question was raised. I'm going to try speculation and see what you make of it, which is, I think a habit can be a personal possession. It's something that can be very personal to you. I think it connects to the point about neurodiversity. And then there are other habits which are so common, and a set of those could just as accurately be described as instincts, potentially. And I make the point not just to try out the definitions, but the speculation I really wanted to try out is that I wonder whether it is, in thinking about habitual ethics, it's the habits that are most personal to us, which are the most morally charged, and which are the ones that require most ethical examination. Not sure about that, because equally you can imagine some things that become very common across a society, which themselves can be very problematic and also require examination. But perhaps those end up being examined for other reasons. I wonder whether the habits that are the most personal are the habits that require the most ethical examination.
I'll try to go through these quickly. So the industry and research question, I think that having now firsthand experience for a few years working with SMEs and small companies, in a sense, we are increasingly live in a reputational economy. And I think that for the most part in the private sector, there is a feeling that they want to do the right thing, but they also want certainty. And so I think the translation of the research into the world of the private sector involves creating some certainty around what are best practices, how do we create kind of useful governance mechanisms. And so I tend to think that we have an opportunity, in a sense, to not think of high relief between public and private sector when we think about kind of ethics and governance issues. We can kind of engage with the communities, and we need to do the work of engaging with communities to bring everybody along into the world of best practice, because at the end of the day, best ethical practice produces better data science. It produces better innovation. Quickly on the habit question, I think that it's important to see a kind of plurality of elements of habit, right? So it is clear that we have, I'm thinking here especially about the work that's been done in the capabilities literature by Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, thinking about Maslow's hierarchy, right? Where we think of habit as having, survival-oriented elements. Habit might also have some higher order kind of comfortability elements, but there are also agency elements to habit and cognitive elements to habit, right? We form good habits of reasoning, for instance, and that's kind of one of the initial points I was trying to make, that we could lose, just as we've gained those good habits of reasoning in modernity, we could easily lose them, right? So I think we just need to have a wide kind of spectrum when we think about what constitutes habits. To John's point, I think I disagree with the democracy point, because I think what you're doing is you're reducing democracy to the political. There's a political way that one can think of it, institutional way that one can look at it, but you can also look at it as Alexis de Tocqueville looked at it, which is as a social concept. And so democracy as a social concept is what we're doing in this room right now. It's having a conversation, an unfinished conversation, where we're trying to figure things out together. Democracy in the social sense is about building public consent. It's about building social license. It's about democratic governance of our behaviors and our technologies. So I think a bottom-up notion of democracy might respond a little bit to the institutional threats of democracy as a political concept. Finally, really quickly, just on this idea of the kind of incompletability of habit. As I was reading the book, it's something that I picked up, and in admission, I wrote at least more than half of my dissertation years ago on Levinas, so I have a sensitivity to the importance of otherness. But what I think is really important when we think about the incompletability of habit is that the thorn of alterity, the thorn of otherness, is in a sense what moves us along in the world. So even if you think of scientific method is based on this notion that nobody can have the last word. No experiment is the final experiment, right? Why? Because there may be other insights that move beyond the insight of today. Tomorrow may be bring in a kind of unknown, insights, unknown ideas. And that dimension of opening up to the future, that is the thorn of alterity, right? It's something that's produced with human interaction and by human interaction. And the last point on that is, and that is about dissonance. So it's about the dissonance between right now and tomorrow, and between me and you. But, and I'm thinking here a little bit of some Japanese thinking. It's not just dissonance, it's also resonance. And what is resonance? If you think about a chord that's struck on a guitar, right? A chord is struck on a guitar and you've got all these different notes, right? Resonating or playing in the chord. These notes are retaining their individual character, but they're also in the harmony of the chord, right? And so resonance means that it's the tension of a distance between the notes that's both bridged in the chord and maintained. And so there is a sense in which otherness is a guarantor of our capacity to communicate, which in a sense means that dissonance is an incomplete story. We also need to sort of understand that alterity also produces resonance.
So Sylvie, if you'd just like to sum up everything in the room and all the open questions in -3 minutes, that would be, no, take as long as you need.
Yeah, well, no. But I mean, look, there's so much I would like to say. One thing, it does go back to Caroline's question a lot, so I'm going to pick on that just a bit. And you've all talked about habit, and I was like, of course, I've tried my best, because I had very irritated colleagues, especially in legal theory, I might say, who told me, but Sylvie, you can't write a book about habitual ethics without explaining what you mean by habit, because in legal theory, it's been given very bad press. In moral philosophy too, by the way. And it's been given bad press because it's often been put into very behaviorist confines. Yeah. So either philosophers will assume that habit is just the domain of sociology. That's just messy stuff, or you rely on the kind of behaviorist neuroscientific approach where some people have tried to define habit where you say, well, if there's behavior that's insensitive to a change in outcome, then there's a habit, right? And then people have tried to put forward like necessary conditions for the existence of a habit. Automaticity is a big one. Never works, yeah. But why? Because in humans, guess what? Actually, when it comes to habit, there is only one thing you can say. You can never say when habit stops, but you can say when it starts, right? And so the only thing I can say with confidence about habit, having written a whole book about it, is that there is an emergence condition. So you don't have a habit unless it has momentarily, at least, escaped your awareness. It could escape your awareness constantly, but it could only escape your awareness momentarily. And that means that actually we humans, unlike many animals, we can have habits, but they need not be totally automatic. So I can be aware of my habits. I can be, in fact, cultivating habits purposefully with the view of changing them or with the view of promoting some sought after kind of outcome. So you can have extremely purposeful habits. And so that's why, of course, in the book I have to explain at length why there's a whole spectrum that you go from, socially conditioned reflexes all the way to highly changeable, highly cultivated, purpose-led behaviors, right? Now, there's one thing I need to say, though, about the resonance thing. There's so much I would like to say, but one thing, the resonance, it was so funny. Because just yesterday, I was in Dubai talking about, it was the Dubai Foundation for the Future, something like that, in this amazing museum. It's called the Museum of the Future. Yeah. Now, guess what the Museum of the Future has? There's 4 exhibits, mainly. Now, some of them really didn't impress me very much, like you were boarding a spacecraft or stuff like that. But there was one where they said, oh, guess what? Because of technology, all our senses are being, they're not calibrated anymore. Yeah? So you enter this pink room with circles everywhere, and then they tell you, no, you're going to recalibrate your senses. And there's these vibrating, I don't know what they, like, stuff. You put your hands above them, and they tell you, sense the vibrations, sense how you can feel things with your hands. It's like, oh, okay, very good. And then, but you're talking about resonance, and it made me, because there was another room where you had to sit in a comfortable, chair, and there were these big gongs with big, powerful vibrations. It's like, feel the vibrations. This is gonna again sort you out, heal your technology-induced numbness, etc. And I have to say, I love the resonance thing. So it's true that we focus too much on dissonance. And actually, I feel very much like tonight, there's something about the whole harmony thing. Oh, we've started from different notes, but maybe, hopefully, we've created something that sounds good. We'll see. Okay.
Now, before I get you to thank Sylvie and all the speakers, perhaps ironically, I've been asked to, the first thing is to say, please do come and join us for the reception, and we can carry on the conversation there. But perhaps ironically, I've been asked to ask on behalf of the Alan Turing Institute, who want to add to their machine-readable archive of each of you, that could you take a few minutes to provide feedback? So you can scan the QR code on the screen, or you'll be sent an email to do it later. So there you go. Please add to the machine-readable archive of your thoughts and opinions so that the Alan Turing Institute can make you more predictable. But apart from that, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for your questions. Apologies, I think some questions did come through on the Slido, which we didn't get to. So if any of you did that and you weren't John, then apologies we didn't get to you. Please sidle up and ask them very discreetly during the reception.
I meant to reply to a question, it escaped my awareness momentarily, but I will come back to it, Boris.
But if you buy the book, it really does go into it in a lot of detail. So yeah, please buy the book, please join us next door, but please give a huge round of applause for a fantastic panel and for Sylvie Delacroix.